We all know that living in the desert is not easy. But imagine being someone whose every choice could mean survival or disaster. The heat burns like a relentless teacher. Water is worth more than gold, and the night sky feels both endless and judging. Life shaped the people before they even learned leadership. In today's video, we'll talk about why it sucked to be Abu Sufyan and the harsh world he had to navigate. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. The desert waits patiently, unchanged by the centuries, as if inviting you to take your first quiet step into Abu Sufyan's world. Before politics, before alliances, before the weight of leadership, there was simply the land, vast, unforgiving, and endlessly shaping the people who lived upon it. To understand the life he carried, you must understand the world that built the very bones of its people. Life in pre-Islamic Arabia did not begin with comfort. It began with heat so intense it blurred the horizon, turning familiar shapes into trembling silhouettes. By midday, the sun pressed down with a kind of authority, demanding that every traveler slow their steps and measure their breath. Sand lifted and swirled around ankles, whispering against skin, reminding you that the desert never stopped moving. Even the strongest men bowed their heads under its weight, feeling the day steal their energy grain by grain. And then, just when you thought you had grown used to it, the sun would slide behind the dunes, and the entire world would change its face. The warmth fled, the air tightened, and the cold came in quick, sharp strokes, settling under cloaks and stinging fingertips. Nights in the open desert felt enormous, the sky stretching too far above you, scattered with quiet stars that seemed to listen to your thoughts more closely than any person ever could. The stillness wrapped around you like a second skin, making every crackle of the fire feel louder, every shift of sand feel meaningful. Water controlled everything. It determined when you traveled, how far you went, and who you trusted. Wells were precious enough to be guarded, argued over, or even fought for. Thirst was not a poetic inconvenience. It was a real danger, one that shaped behavior, schedules, and entire migration patterns. People grew up learning how to read the sky for signs of rain, how to test the taste of water for safety, and how to ration every drop with quiet discipline. Even the ground beneath your feet demanded respect. A calm morning could twist suddenly into a sandstorm, swallowing your vision and carving your skin raw with flying grains. A familiar path could shift after a single windy night, confusing even seasoned travelers. And far beyond the dunes, unseen eyes often watched the trade routes, raiders who waited for the weary, the slow, or the unlucky. In such an environment, people became students of instinct. Children learned to sense shifts in the wind. Adults memorized the landmarks that rose from the yaws, dunes like gentle anchors in a sea of beige. Elders carried stories that were half wisdom, half warning, teaching the next generation how to survive a land that gave nothing easily. Patience became a virtue, not because it was noble, but because impatience could kill you. This land also taught humility. When the desert swallowed sound, your thoughts grew louder. When the sky felt too wide, your worries felt small. When darkness stretched endlessly in every direction, you understood your place in the world. Vulnerable, temporary, dependent on others. People learned to value loyalty because the desert punished solitude. They learned to respect leadership because a single, poor decision could endanger everyone. Yet, even in its harshness, Arabia held a strange beauty. Dawn painted the dunes in soft silver. Afternoon winds sculpted new patterns on the sand. Nights revealed a sky so full of stars it felt as if light itself was resting on the world. This balance, danger wrapped in beauty, created a rhythm of life that shaped the hearts and habits of entire tribes. And so, before we step into the complicated choices, fears, and responsibilities that filled Abu Sufyan's lifetime, we linger here in the landscape that shaped him long before he ever shaped history. From this harsh environment grew a society that learned to bend but not break, adapt but not surrender. And naturally, the next step in understanding his world is to look not just at the land itself, but at the people who built their lives upon it and the tribal bonds that held everything together. The people who lived in this world were shaped as much by each other as they were by the land. Once you understand the desert's quiet demands, you begin to understand why tribes became more than families. They became lifelines. Nothing in Arabia stood alone. A well, a caravan, a home, a name. Everything depended on the strength and reputation of the group behind you. In a place where the earth offered so little, people became the true source of safety. To grow up in a tribe meant learning early that every action echoed far beyond yourself. A careless word could spark a feud. A failed promise could stain a family's name. Loyalty wasn't a poetic virtue. It was the currency that kept you alive. If trouble found you on the road, you needed someone who would ride out in your defense. If drought struck, you needed people willing to share their water. If conflict erupted, you needed allies who would stand beside you without hesitation. Survival depended on belonging, and belonging depended on loyalty. Children learned this before they learned to recite poetry or identify constellations. They saw how adults spoke to one another when they lowered their voices, when they bowed their heads, when they exchanged the subtle signals of respect that kept harmony from slipping away. A child who wandered too far had to be taught that the world was not a friendly place. A child who spoke too freely had to be reminded that honor was not a toy. And a child who disobeyed was reminded that their mistakes were never theirs alone. The tribe carried the consequences. This constant awareness shaped personalities from an early age. People grew careful with their speech, protective of their kin, and deeply attentive to the moods of those around them. Marriage, alliances, disputes, all were judged through the lens of what the tribe gained or risked. Even friendships carried weight. You didn't simply choose companions based on personal preference. You considered who their families were, what reputations they carried, and what doors they could open or close for your own people. There was comfort in this structure, a sense of belonging, of shared purpose, of knowing that you were never truly alone. But there was heaviness too, a kind of invisible pressure that pressed against your ribs with every decision. One misstep could ripple outward like a stone tossed in a still pool, fracturing relationships you'd never even considered. A promise broken could follow you for years. A dispute mishandled could reignite forgotten tensions. Even silence could be dangerous if it was interpreted the wrong way. And so, people learned to navigate their social world with the same attentiveness they used to navigate the dunes. Conversations were measured, alliances carefully maintained, and traditions upheld not only out of reverence, but out of necessity. A tribe was a shield, but like all shields, it demanded upkeep. You were expected to defend your people's honor, contribute to their prosperity, and carry their stories with pride. To be careless was to be vulnerable, and vulnerability was a luxury the desert never allowed. In such a world, children grew into adults with a deep understanding of their place. They knew who they represented. They knew what their ancestors had endured, and they understood that their lives were threads woven into something far larger than themselves. Loyalty was not merely encouraged, it was enforced by the land, by society, and by the silent, watchful eyes of generations past. It was within this intricate web of expectation that Abu Sufyan grew up, shaped by the same invisible pressures that molded the people around him. But his upbringing carried an added weight, for he belonged to one of the most respected and influential tribes in all of Arabia. And as we shift from the general world of tribal life into the more specific world of Mecca, we begin to see how growing up within the Quraysh brought a unique mixture of privilege, responsibility, and relentless scrutiny. Growing up within the Quraysh meant learning early that your tribe's name arrived in a room before you did. People spoke it with a mixture of respect and caution, aware of the influence it carried. Quraysh was not just another clan among many. It was the heartbeat of Mecca, its merchants, its caretakers, its negotiators. Children born into it inherited a world already shaped by power, and that power came with expectations as sharp and demanding as the desert sun. Quraysh's prestige did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, layered through generations of careful alliances, shrewd trade agreements, and a reputation for keeping order in a city that needed stability to survive. Mecca's central position in the region placed it at a crossroads of culture, commerce, and politics. Travelers passed through from every direction, carrying news, goods, and stories. Quraysh sat at the center of that swirl, managing relationships with neighboring tribes, handling disputes, and maintaining peace within a city that relied on cooperation for its prosperity. This status brought undeniable advantages. Being Qurayshi meant being part of a tribe others listened to. Your words held weight. Your opinions mattered. Doors that might stay shut for others opened more easily for you. But woven into this privilege was an ever-present pressure to uphold the tribe's honor. A careless action could be read as arrogance, a hesitation as weakness. People watched you closely, not because they admired you, but because your mistakes could become opportunities for them. Prestige, after all, did not come without enemies. Rival tribes resented the influence Quraysh held, believing it tipped the balance of power too far toward Mecca. Others envied the economic success Quraysh enjoyed, built on trade networks that reached far beyond the city's borders. Whenever a caravan prospered, whispers rose in distant camps. Whenever a treaty was signed, someone, somewhere, felt slighted. These quiet tensions formed a constant hum beneath daily life, an awareness that threats could emerge just as quickly as opportunities. Within Mecca itself, even among tribes who depended on Qurayshi leadership, there were disagreements, disputes, and old wounds that never fully healed. Maintaining unity required diplomacy, patience, and occasionally a show of strength. Leaders of Quraysh walked a narrow path between appeasing neighbors and protecting their own interests. A misjudged moment of generosity could be seen as weakness. A firm stance could ignite tensions. Every decision was a balancing act, and everyone in the tribe understood that miscalculations carried heavy consequences. For families like Abu Sufyan's, this meant their household existed under a kind of quiet spotlight. Every visitor, every negotiation, every gathering had the potential to influence alliances. Children overheard discussions about strategy long before they understood the meaning behind the words. Adults weighed their tone carefully when speaking about other tribes. Even simple hospitality could become political, as generosity signaled strength and unity within Quraysh. This constant interplay between power and vulnerability shaped not only the tribe's external reputation, but also its internal culture. Pride and caution lived side by side. Competition coexisted with cooperation. Honor was a shared resource, protected fiercely and guarded collectively. To be part of the Quraysh meant belonging to something larger, something that demanded loyalty while offering protection. But it also meant carrying a responsibility that could feel heavier than a shield, especially for those raised to one day lead. Abu Sufyan grew up within this atmosphere, surrounded by stories of past victories, warned about old rivalries, and taught that every decision echoed far beyond the moment it was made. He inherited a world in which influence was both a gift and a burden, where the tribe's strengths created as many challenges as advantages. And as he matured, he came to understand that Mecca's power did not rest solely on its name or reputation, but on the lifeblood of its economy, the intricate trade networks that tied it to lands far beyond the desert. These networks brought wealth and opportunity, but also a new layer of complexity that shaped every aspect of life to come. The wealth and influence of Quraysh might have impressed outsiders, but anyone who grew up in Mecca knew exactly where that strength came from. It wasn't from grand halls or glittering treasures. It wasn't from armies or fortresses. It came from the long, winding trade routes that stretched across the desert like fragile threads, binding Mecca to distant lands. Those routes demanded courage, endurance, and a willingness to face danger with steady hands. And for families like Abu Sufyan's, caravans were not distant ventures. They were part of daily life, always present in whispered calculations, quiet prayers, and long absences. Modern stories sometimes paint caravan travel as an adventure, a journey beneath endless blue sky, with camels plodding peacefully through golden dunes. But the truth was far less romantic. Every trip began with tension. Men gathered to decide how much water to carry, how many guards to hire, which path might be safer that season. A single miscalculation could doom the entire journey. The desert did not forgive mistakes. Long before the caravan even left Mecca, there were decisions that pushed heavily on a young man's shoulders. Abu Sufyan would have watched the elders debate routes and cargo as if they were discussing life or death, because often they were. spices, leather, textiles, grain, incense, all precious, all vulnerable. A fully loaded caravan was a moving treasure chest, and raiders knew exactly when to strike. Once on the road, each morning began with the soft groans of camels rising to their feet and the faint chill of dawn pressing against your skin. The caravan stretched out in a long line, men checking straps, tightening ropes, whispering to their animals as the first light crept across the sand. There was a strange peace to these early hours, but underneath it ran a quiet fear. Everyone knew that danger didn't announce itself. You could walk for days in silence before suddenly finding yourself surrounded. Heat arrived quickly, bringing a heaviness that settled into bones and slowed every movement. Sand shifted under the weight of the animals, making progress feel like climbing an endless slope. You tasted dust with every breath, and no matter how carefully you wrapped your face, grains of sand found a way in. The sun carved shadows beneath your eyes, and thirst became a constant companion, whispering at you all day long. It was in these hours that men often questioned why they'd chosen such a life, until they remembered that survival depended on it. And then there were the storms. Nothing prepared you for the way the desert could turn against itself, whipping up walls of sand that swallowed the horizon and erased every familiar landmark. The sky darkened. The air roared. Men shouted to stay together, their voices lost in the wind. Camels became restless, stumbling as sand stung their legs. You could barely see your own hands. In moments like these, fear took on a physical weight, pressing against your ribs as you prayed the storm would break before your resolve did. But storms weren't the only threat. Raiders watched the caravans with hungry eyes, moving swiftly on horseback, striking without warning. Travelers learned to read the desert for signs. Dust rising in the distance. Tracks too fresh to ignore. The uneasy behavior of animals sensing danger before humans did. A caravan might fight, bargain, or flee, but no option guaranteed survival. Every journey carried the possibility of loss. Food and water were rationed with strict discipline. A single drought could empty wells along the route, forcing caravans to travel farther between stops. Men grew thin on these trips, worn down by the hunger that gnawed at them from inside. At night, even around the fire, the fear lingered. The darkness amplified every sound. The cry of a distant animal, the rustle of shifting sand. Even the quiet breathing of your companions felt like something fragile that could be taken away at any moment. For Abu Sufyan, involvement in these caravans began early, giving him a first-hand education in caution, leadership, and the razor-thin line between prosperity and disaster. Every moment on the road taught him something about patience, about danger, about the unpredictable nature of fortune itself. These lessons would shape the way he saw the world, the way he weighed risks, and the way he understood the delicate balance between strength and vulnerability. Yet caravans were not only economic ventures, they were deeply political. Each journey required negotiations with tribes along the route, agreements about safe passage, and promises that carried their own unspoken consequences. And as the trade routes grew more tangled with politics, the responsibilities placed on leaders like those of Quraysh became heavier still, setting the stage for the complex web of alliances and tensions that defined the next chapter of his life. Traveling across the desert was only half the challenge. The other half began the moment a caravan approached the lands of another tribe. Before the camels slowed, before the dust settled, before a single greeting was exchanged, everyone felt the same cold awareness settle in their stomachs. Trust was fragile out here, and often it didn't exist at all. The desert might be harsh, but people, when uncertain, hungry, or desperate, could be even harsher. No caravan passed through Arabia without entering the sphere of another tribe's authority. Every region belonged to someone, and those someones watched from the shadows of dunes, from ridges overlooking narrow valleys, from behind tents where only the faintest flicker of movement betrayed their presence. They knew who you were long before you reached them. They observed your numbers, your cargo, your guards, and the nervous way your hands tightened around reins when the landscape grew suspiciously quiet. Negotiation wasn't a formality. It was survival. Men like Abu Sufyan learned early that words could be weapons, shields, or bridges depending on how carefully they were chosen. A greeting spoken too confidently could be mistaken for arrogance. A greeting spoken too softly could be read as weakness. Even body language had to be measured. Standing too tall, bowing too deeply, pausing too long before speaking. Every gesture had meaning, and any misstep could ripple into danger. When caravans approached a tribal boundary, they often stopped well before the first tent. A small group of negotiators would go ahead, while the rest waited in uneasy stillness. Those who stepped forward did so knowing that the wrong sentence might empty every camel behind them. They approached slowly, hands visible, voices steady, offering respectful nods that said, "We acknowledge your land," without suggesting, "We fear it." It was a delicate balance that required instinct and experience. Some tribes welcomed caravans warmly, recognizing the mutual benefit of trade and the wealth it brought to their lands. But others, especially those who had clashed with Quraysh in the past, required careful handling. Old grudges lingered in the sand like buried embers, ready to flare with the slightest gust of tension. A single careless phrase could reignite a conflict no one wanted to revisit. Negotiators often exchanged gifts first. These gifts were not bribes. They were signals of goodwill, reminders that cooperation offered value to both sides. Dates preserved in honey, leather goods, finely woven cloth, humble items that carried enormous symbolic weight. After the gifts came the discussions, moving slowly, like two travelers testing the ground before crossing a river. Agreements about safe passage, water access, and temporary hospitality were made with cautious optimism. But not every meeting went smoothly. Some tribes demanded more than was reasonable, testing the limits of Qurayshi patience. Others asked for political favors, future support, or alliances that complicated relationships elsewhere. A few tribes simply didn't trust Quraysh, suspecting hidden motives behind every polite phrase. Caravans had to decide whether to negotiate harder, reroute entirely, or risk passing through under tenuous agreements. Abu Sufyan, even in his younger years, likely saw firsthand how these interactions shaped outcomes. He would have watched leaders debate responses, weighing respect against firmness, generosity against prudence. He would have learned that diplomacy wasn't about winning. It was about preventing disaster. Success meant leaving a meeting with everyone still feeling they had maintained their dignity. Failure meant returning to a restless caravan with shadows of danger trailing close behind. Sometimes, no matter how carefully negotiations were handled, tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. A tribe might grant safe passage, but whisper among themselves about the true value of the caravan passing through. Guards tightened their grips on weapons. Riders scanned the horizon more often. Even the camels sensed unease, shifting anxiously as the caravan moved forward under uncertain terms. This constant dance of courtesy and caution shaped Abu Sufyan's understanding of the world. It showed him that alliances were fragile, that peace was maintained not through force, but through delicate agreements, and that human motives were rarely straightforward. The road demanded strength, yes, but it demanded even more wisdom. And when the caravan finally returned to Mecca, the negotiations did not stay behind in the desert. They echoed through the city's halls and marketplaces, affecting how Quraysh positioned itself among its neighbors. Each agreement, each dispute, each uneasy truce added weight to the political atmosphere back home, where internal tensions simmered quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest spark to shift the balance again. Returning to Mecca after a long journey always felt like stepping into a calmer world. But that calm was deceptive. On the surface, the city hummed with routine, merchants calling out their prices, travelers resting in shaded courtyards, families preparing meals, children weaving through narrow streets. It looked peaceful, steady, almost insulated from the dangers of the open desert. But people who lived there knew better. Mecca's stability was not a natural gift. It was something carefully maintained, endlessly negotiated, and constantly threatened by tensions no outsider could see at first glance. For the city to thrive, peace had to hold. Caravans needed safe passage. Markets needed steady traffic. Families needed security. Any disruption could ripple through Mecca like a crack through stone, affecting trade, alliances, and the carefully balanced relationships that kept the city functioning. The urban calm that greeted returning travelers was not a sign of simplicity, it was a sign of effort. Quietly, constantly, leaders worked to keep rivalries from igniting and ensure that old grudges remained buried beneath layers of diplomacy. Inside Mecca, clans held their own positions, histories, and memories. Some supported one another openly. Others did so out of necessity. Others still offered polite smiles while quietly nursing grievances that stretched back generations. A shared city did not erase these lines. It merely painted over them with civility. People knew who their allies were. They knew who watched them closely. They knew whose pride was easily injured and whose ambition needed constant attention. A single, careless remark at a gathering could erode trust that had taken years to build. Most days, disputes were managed through soft conversations held in shaded courtyards or behind closed doors. Men with calm voices and sharp minds worked to cool tensions before they spread. They were practiced at reading expressions, listening for subtle shifts in tone, and guiding conversations away from dangerous paths. But this work was exhausting, and it never ended. Some conflicts simmered for so long they became part of the city's background hum, always present, waiting for the wrong moment to surge forward. Abu Sufyan grew up in a Mecca where reputation was everything. The slightest insult, real or perceived, could force a clan to respond, not out of personal anger, but out of obligation to protect its standing. A failure to act could be misread as weakness. Acting too aggressively could be misread as provocation. Every decision was weighed in terms of its consequences for the city's fragile balance. Children learned early to choose their words carefully, and adults learned to measure their tempers even in private moments. There were also the ambitions of individuals to consider. Some men sought influence quietly, building it through strategic alliances. Others pursued it openly, carving out their place in Meccan society with bold gestures. Everyone had an angle, a hope, a fear, a desire to secure a future for their family's name. But ambition, even when well-meaning, created friction. When one man rose, another worried he might fall. When one clan gained, another wondered what it would cost them in the long run. Peace was a shared goal, but not always a shared priority. Markets and public spaces reflected this delicate balance. A merchant's success could spark envy. A wealthy household could draw unwanted attention. A generous act could inspire admiration or suspicion, depending on who witnessed it. Mecca looked harmonious, but harmony required an endless chain of careful choices. Choices that weighed every word, gesture, and alliance. Leaders spent as much time preventing conflict as they did guiding progress. For someone like Abu Sufyan, this meant navigating a world where nothing was taken at face value. A quiet smile could hide disapproval. A compliment could conceal a warning. A gift could come with strings attached. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to observe details others overlooked, and to anticipate problems before they surfaced. This awareness shaped the way he approached almost every aspect of life, teaching him that stability was something constantly earned, never assumed. Yet even when peace held, there was an unspoken fear beneath the surface. Prosperity attracted attention. Wealth invited danger. A city that thrived as Mecca did became a tempting target, not only for raiders on the desert routes, but for rivals within and beyond its walls. The more Mecca prospered, the more watchful it had to become. And as we move deeper into Abu Sufyan's world, we begin to see how this growing prosperity brought with it a new kind of tension. One rooted not in politics or pride alone, but in the rising fear of what wealth could take away just as easily as it gave. In Mecca, wealth was visible, tangible, and impossible to ignore. Merchants displayed fine textiles, aromatic spices, and imported goods that gleamed under the midday sun. A person of influence could secure favors, command loyalty, and provide for their family in ways that others could only dream of. Yet this very visibility came with a constant shadow: envy. Families, rivals, and even allies could grow resentful or opportunistic, watching closely for any misstep or moment of vulnerability. For those who managed successful trade routes or controlled caravans, the wealth carried heavy responsibilities. It was not enough to accumulate. One had to distribute wisely, maintain fair dealings, and uphold trust in a tightly knit society where word of mouth traveled faster than any messenger. Decisions about who to partner with or which debts to honor could ripple across Mecca's clans, altering relationships in subtle but lasting ways. A misjudged alliance could lead to broken agreements or whispered slanders, weakening one's standing and opening the door for rivals to maneuver. Alongside envy, there was the tangible risk of theft or fraud. Merchants transporting goods across deserts faced bandits, but even within the city walls, deception lurked. Trusted employees might siphon profits or exploit gaps in oversight. Guarding wealth required both shrewdness and vigilance, a combination of practical security and social intelligence. Leaders who appeared careless or naive risked losing more than material possessions. They risked credibility, the kind that defined status in Meccan society. Political rivalries added another layer of tension. Every family sought influence, and prominence made one a target for intrigue. Alliances could shift overnight, often influenced by marriages, trade contracts, or informal networks of loyalty. Negotiating these relationships demanded tact, foresight, and, occasionally, calculated restraint. Public gestures, like hosting a feast or funding a communal project, could signal generosity, strength, or subtle dominance, depending on interpretation. Understanding how others would perceive each move was as critical as the move itself. Yet, wealth was also a blessing. It enabled participation in community life, the ability to support family and dependents, and the chance to shape civic and religious projects. Providing for the public good enhanced reputation and reinforced networks of loyalty. Those who navigated the dangers carefully found that the same wealth that attracted envy could be leveraged to secure safety and influence, creating a foundation for stability in a city defined by competition and ambition. Even with careful management, the stress of visibility was constant. Every gift, every transaction, every conversation could spark admiration or suspicion. The line between success and overreach was narrow. Leaders in Mecca walked this tightrope daily, aware that any misstep could magnify personal risk and shift the city's fragile equilibrium. As the years advanced, these pressures compounded. The city that had thrived on trade and negotiation increasingly felt the strain of individual ambitions and simmering rivalries. Wealth, for all its comfort and capability, was inseparable from danger. The delicate balance of influence, responsibility, and risk would set the stage for conflicts and shifts in loyalty, quietly preparing the city for the changes that lay ahead. The promise of prosperity could ignite hope or suspicion, and the next era would test those who had mastered the art of navigating both. The careful balance of wealth, alliances, and reputation that had defined Meccan life was fragile. Even the most skilled leaders sensed a subtle shift in the air, an undercurrent of unease that could not be ignored. As the city thrived, whispers of new ideas began to ripple through its streets, challenging long-held traditions and sparking questions that unsettled both merchants and elders alike. The stability of Mecca was no longer guaranteed, and the very foundations of authority were being tested. In the heart of the city, life continued with its familiar rhythms. Merchants haggled over prices, children ran through narrow streets, and families gathered to share meals beneath the fading sun. Yet beneath this routine, tension was growing. New ways of thinking circulated quietly, carried by travelers, traders, and the curious minds of Mecca's youth. These ideas were simple, yet radical in their implications, touching on justice, fairness, and the responsibilities of individuals within the community. For the city's leaders, these shifts were deeply unsettling. Authority had long been grounded in tradition, family ties, and established codes of conduct. Any suggestion that these customs could be questioned threatened not just individual power, but the cohesion of entire clans. Leaders watched conversations, gatherings, and debates with a wary eye, anxious for signs of wavering loyalty or shifting influence. Fear became an almost constant companion, influencing decisions ranging from trade to legal disputes. The spread of new ideas was subtle but persistent. Some were whispered in marketplaces, where travelers exchanged news from distant regions. Others emerged in quiet gatherings as neighbors debated morality, leadership, or fairness in daily transactions. The ideas themselves did not demand rebellion, yet they challenged assumptions that had long gone unquestioned. In response, some elders doubled down on tradition, emphasizing rituals, family hierarchies, and long-standing expectations. Others sought to monitor those most receptive to change, fearing that even a single misstep could escalate into broader unrest. For ordinary citizens, the effects were palpable. Conversations carried an undercurrent of caution. Public behavior became measured as the line between curiosity and suspicion grew thin. Families discussed the implications of new thinking in hushed tones, and even friendships could be tested when opinions diverged. Daily life, once predictable, now carried an intangible weight of uncertainty, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Merchants and leaders alike began to realize that influence required more than wealth or status. It required perceptiveness, patience, and an ability to anticipate shifts before they fully unfolded. Decisions about alliances, trade partnerships, or public gestures were no longer simple. They became tactical, almost like moves in a careful game of strategy, because every action could signal support or dissent, loyalty or disapproval. The subtle reshaping of thought threatened to reorder priorities and allegiances across the city. Despite the tension, Mecca's vibrancy endured. Markets remained busy, families continued to celebrate marriages and births, and daily rituals persisted. Yet beneath this surface, the seeds of transformation were quietly taking root. Every whispered question, every moment of reflection, nudged the city toward change, challenging those who had long relied on established power structures to govern both behavior and belief. By the time these ideas had fully reached the ears of Mecca's most influential figures, a new reality had begun to take shape. Authority was no longer absolute, and the rules that had guided daily life for generations were being reconsidered. The city that had once thrived on predictability now faced a subtle, growing unpredictability. The delicate balance between tradition and innovation, fear and curiosity, would soon set the stage for tensions capable of reshaping Mecca's very identity. The subtle tremors of change had begun to disturb Mecca's streets, marketplaces, and council halls, and those in positions of power could no longer afford hesitation. The currents of influence, loyalty, and ambition pressed in every direction, making each decision a delicate negotiation between opportunity and danger. The city that had once seemed so steady now felt like a shifting stage, and navigating it demanded constant attention, calculation, and resolve. Life in Mecca, under Abu Sufyan's leadership, was a study in pressure from all sides. Internally, tribal loyalties were never simple. Each clan had its own ambitions, grievances, and alliances, and maintaining unity required constant vigilance. One wrong word at a gathering, one overlooked slight, could spark resentment that rippled outward. Elders reminded their followers of ancient codes, merchants leveraged debts, and families weighed the long-term consequences of every alliance. The delicate network of trust that held Mecca together was under constant strain, and those responsible for leadership walked a tightrope above an ever-present risk of collapse. Externally, political pressure intensified. Neighboring cities and tribes observed Mecca's moves with sharp interest, ready to exploit weakness or instability. Trade agreements, diplomatic gestures, and even seemingly minor concessions had the power to alter the balance of influence across the region. Leaders had to anticipate not only immediate reactions, but also cascading effects, because a misjudged action could embolden rivals and erode carefully maintained authority. Letters, envoys, and messages from afar carried both opportunities and threats, demanding rapid assessment and strategic response. Shifting loyalties complicated matters further. Friendships and alliances could fracture suddenly, often influenced by personal ambition or changing circumstances. Those who had once appeared steadfast could reconsider their position in a heartbeat, and those who had been cautious might suddenly assert themselves. Navigating this shifting landscape required not only intelligence and foresight, but also an acute understanding of human nature. Observing patterns of behavior, reading between lines, and predicting the impact of words and gestures became as vital as controlling armies or managing trade. The pressures of leadership were relentless. Every decision, whether about trade, alliances, or public appearances, carried weighty consequences. Misjudgments could lead to loss of wealth, erosion of trust, or even violent retaliation. Yet in the midst of this constant tension, Mecca also relied on leaders to provide stability, direction, and reassurance. The duality of expectation and scrutiny was exhausting. Leaders were expected to act decisively and maintain order, while also navigating an invisible labyrinth of competing interests, threats, and ambitions. Even ordinary citizens felt the effects of these pressures. Markets, streets, and neighborhoods were influenced by shifting allegiances and political calculations. Rumors spread quickly, inflaming caution or excitement, and people adjusted their behavior in subtle ways, balancing curiosity with the instinct for self-preservation. Mecca's social fabric, woven over generations, flexed under strain but endured, revealing the resilience of community even amid uncertainty. Yet for Abu Sufyan and others at the helm, the greatest challenge lay ahead. Managing internal friction, external threats, and volatile loyalties was one thing. The reality of conflict was another. The strategies, negotiations, and careful calculations that had preserved influence so far would soon face their sternest test. Pressure in every direction was a constant companion, and the looming prospect of war would magnify every misstep, every alliance, and every decision. The city's leaders, along with those who looked to them for guidance, were stepping into a new chapter where courage, strategy, and the limits of loyalty would be tested as never before. The city's streets, so often filled with negotiation, commerce, and cautious conversation, carried a new tension. Every rumor of unrest, every shift in alliances, reminded leaders and citizens alike that the calm of daily life was fragile. The pressures that had long tested loyalty and strategy now hinted at a far harsher reality: open conflict. The thought of war was never distant. It hovered like a storm cloud over Mecca, threatening to unleash destruction on anyone unprepared. In Arabia, the prospect of battle brought with it a unique terror. It was not only the fear of personal harm, but also the anxiety over the unpredictability of combat. Armies could gather with little warning. Raids could strike trade caravans, and rival clans might exploit even a minor lapse in vigilance. Preparing for war demanded exhausting attention to strategy, logistics, and morale. Supplies had to be secured, routes carefully considered, and alliances reaffirmed, all while maintaining the appearance of control and confidence in the city itself. Even the most seasoned leaders felt the weight of this fear. Every decision about troop movements, defensive positions, and potential negotiations carried immense risk. Miscalculations could lead to devastating losses, and the smallest error might embolden enemies or create internal unrest. The uncertainty of human behavior, combined with the harsh realities of desert warfare, meant that anxiety was constant. Leaders could not simply react. They had to anticipate, plan, and sometimes restrain action to avoid unnecessary escalation. The mere preparation for battle affected daily life. Caravans were rerouted, marketplaces grew quieter, and citizens adjusted routines out of caution. Families discussed contingencies in hushed tones, while young men trained or stood ready to defend their clans. The sound of sharpening swords, or the careful inspection of supplies, was a reminder that even routine tasks now carried weight. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the next decision could tip the balance toward devastation or survival. This constant vigilance created its own kind of exhaustion. Leaders were expected to appear calm and decisive, even while sleepless nights were spent weighing risks and reviewing strategies. Every meeting, every conversation was analyzed for potential impact on the fragile web of alliances and rivalries. The terror of war was not just in the battlefield. It was in the anticipation, the uncertainty, and the knowledge that one wrong move could undo years of careful leadership. Yet, amidst this tension, resilience emerged. Families, merchants, and warriors alike adapted to the unrelenting pressure, finding ways to maintain daily life despite the looming threat. The city's culture of negotiation, strategy, and awareness became even more critical, as survival depended on the ability to respond quickly and wisely to rapidly changing circumstances. Even fear could be harnessed as a tool, sharpening focus and reinforcing unity among those willing to act decisively. Still, the reality remained stark. War was a shadow that could fall at any moment, and no measure of preparation could eliminate its unpredictability. The anticipation of open conflict revealed the weight of leadership more clearly than any single battle ever could. Decisions made in quiet council rooms had consequences that extended far beyond the city walls, affecting trade, families, and the balance of power across the region. The fear that gripped Mecca was a constant reminder of the burdens carried by those at the helm, shaping their choices and testing their resolve. As the city braced for potential conflict, it became clear that the true challenge of leadership was not only managing strategy and alliances, but also enduring the psychological weight of responsibility. Every action, every calculation, and every precaution carried the echoes of potential catastrophe, a burden that could only be carried with skill, patience, and unwavering vigilance. The anticipation of conflict had settled over Mecca like a heavy, unrelenting heat. Plans had been made, alliances tested, and every precaution weighed, yet the uncertainty of war remained. For those tasked with leadership, the responsibility extended far beyond strategy and negotiation. The lives of men and the futures of families and clans rested on each decision. Command was no longer abstract. It was a burden that could not be shared or delegated. Leadership in such a time was never glamorous. Orders were scrutinized at every level, and success or failure was measured in human terms. A single misjudged command could cost lives, destabilize loyalty, or shift the balance of influence across the city and beyond. Leaders were constantly aware that their choices had immediate and often irreversible consequences. Retreats, victories, or losses were not simply tactical outcomes. They were moral reckonings that reflected directly on those at the helm. Men under command observed everything with sharp eyes. Obedience depended as much on trust as on discipline, and leaders had to balance authority with fairness, courage with prudence. Soldiers judged not only the wisdom of orders, but also the integrity and resolve of the person giving them. Hesitation, rashness, or even perceived favoritism could erode confidence, creating fractures that no strategy could repair. Every rallying cry, every decision to advance or withdraw was a test of both skill and character. The weight of responsibility extended beyond the battlefield. Leaders carried the guilt of loss and the moral burden of choices that affected not only warriors, but entire communities. Every casualty weighed heavily, every failure replayed in memory. The knowledge that decisions were never private, that they were evaluated by those who followed and by those who observed from afar, magnified the pressure. Even the most seasoned leader could not escape the introspection that accompanied command, the endless questioning of whether each choice was right, sufficient, or just. Preparation, strategy, and discipline were necessary, but not sufficient. Leadership demanded constant observation, quick adaptation, and the ability to inspire confidence even in moments of fear. Orders had to be clear, expectations communicated, and the morale of men maintained despite uncertainty. The city, the families, and the wider network of alliances all depended on visible competence and unwavering resolve. Mistakes were remembered, doubts magnified, and any sign of weakness could embolden rivals or undermine cohesion. The psychological burden of leadership grew in tandem with the tangible pressures of command. Leaders experienced isolation, for they could not fully share the weight of responsibility with anyone. Each choice, whether celebrated or criticized, was ultimately theirs alone. The constant need to anticipate outcomes, weigh human behavior, and respond decisively created an ongoing mental strain that was impossible to escape. Even moments of rest were often shadowed by the replay of decisions and their potential consequences. Yet, within this relentless weight, a certain clarity emerged. Leaders learned to focus on what could be controlled: plans, logistics, morale, while accepting that uncertainty was an inseparable part of their role. Their authority, their foresight, and their ability to inspire confidence became the most reliable tools for navigating chaos. The burden of command was immense, but it also shaped those who bore it, forging resilience, judgment, and a deep understanding of human nature. As the city moved ever closer to the realities of war, it became clear that leadership was as much a mental and moral test as a tactical one. Commanding men when lives depended on you was not an honor in the traditional sense. It was a responsibility that demanded endurance, judgment, and the courage to confront fear, doubt, and consequence in equal measure. Even as decisions were made with careful calculation and orders were executed with precision, the quiet of night offered no relief. The city's streets grew still, lamps flickered low, and leaders retired to chambers that seemed suddenly too small to contain the weight they carried. In the darkness, there were no advisors, no soldiers, no allies, only thoughts, doubts, and the persistent questions of whether choices had been right, sufficient, or fair. The nights were long, and sleep often came in brief, uneasy intervals. Every conversation, every negotiation, and every command was replayed in the mind, dissected for errors or missed opportunities. Fear of misjudgment gnawed quietly at resolve, and the responsibility for the lives of others refused to loosen its grip. Even small incidents, an unexpected message from a distant ally, a rumor of discontent in a dependent clan, could ignite hours of restless contemplation. Leaders had to weigh the morality of their decisions alongside their practical consequences, a mental burden that never truly lifted. Private fears were compounded by the impossibility of sharing them. Confidences could be dangerous. Revealing too much might be interpreted as weakness, even hesitation. The inner life of a leader was necessarily guarded, and this isolation intensified anxiety. Each choice was simultaneously personal and public, practical and symbolic. Were alliances strong enough? Were troops prepared? Had every risk been accounted for? Even when reassured by the apparent loyalty of followers, leaders felt the tremor of uncertainty beneath the surface. Emotional pressure was as constant as political vigilance. Pride, doubt, hope, and fear intermingled in quiet moments, each demanding attention. The weight of expectation, both self-imposed and imposed by others, pressed relentlessly. Mistakes, real or imagined, were magnified in reflection. Even victories were tempered by the awareness that another challenge, another unexpected crisis, lay just over the horizon. The mind became a landscape of questions, calculations, and scenarios, stretching endlessly, like the desert surrounding the city itself. These nights of second-guessing were not idle indulgence. They were part of the cost of responsibility. Leadership demanded forethought and vigilance that extended beyond the day's visible tasks. Decisions had to be anticipated, human behavior predicted, and the shifting tides of loyalty and influence monitored continuously. In private, leaders confronted the full weight of what they carried, not just strategies or alliances, but the hopes, fears, and lives of those dependent on them. Even in moments of solitude, reflection was never purely introspective. Every fear or doubt was intertwined with political reality. Would a harsh judgment fracture loyalty? Could hesitation be misread as weakness? Could a small error ripple outward to endanger trade, alliances, or even lives? These questions haunted leaders long after councils adjourned and public gatherings dispersed, leaving a sense of relentless responsibility that blurred the boundary between night and day. Yet within this pressure, clarity occasionally emerged. The solitude of night allowed leaders to anticipate consequences with a perspective that daytime activity obscured. Plans were refined, contingencies considered, and strategies mentally rehearsed. The mind became a laboratory for judgment, and even worry became a tool, sharpening awareness and fostering preparation. Despite the exhaustion, these hours of reflection were an integral part of sustaining authority, making decisions more deliberate and deliberate choices more resilient. As the first light of dawn touched the city, the anxieties of night shifted into the calculations of day. Doubt and worry gave way to action, but the memory of restless hours lingered, reminding leaders of the ever-present pressures that accompanied their position. The private, emotional toll was inseparable from the public responsibilities, shaping judgment, guiding strategy, and preparing the city's leaders for the complex realities of Meccan politics that awaited each morning. As dawn broke over Mecca, the pressures of leadership and the private anxieties of the night spilled into the city's streets. Markets buzzed with cautious energy, council halls filled with hushed negotiations, and alliances were quietly tested in every corner of the city. Beneath the routines of commerce and ceremony, however, fractures had begun to appear, economic, tribal, and ideological cracks that threatened the delicate cohesion of Mecca. Those responsible for maintaining order could see the tensions, but holding the center together required more than strategy. It demanded constant vigilance, judgment, and the careful calibration of authority. The city was a mosaic of competing interests. Wealthier merchants sought influence through trade, while smaller traders navigated the pressures of survival and loyalty. Families traced their power through ancestral connections, each seeking advantage while attempting to honor tradition. Even as the marketplace hummed with prosperity, disputes simmered in the shadows, and minor conflicts over debts, land, or trade rights could escalate into larger rifts. Economic tensions intertwined with social hierarchy, creating a web of interdependence and competition that leaders had to navigate daily. Tribal divisions added another layer of complexity. Alliances were fragile, often shifting according to circumstances, marriages, or individual ambition. Loyalty was conditional and constantly tested. A family or clan that had supported a leader one day might question them the next if promises went unfulfilled or opportunities appeared elsewhere. Resolving disputes required careful diplomacy, deep knowledge of relationships, and sometimes a willingness to make sacrifices for the sake of broader stability. No gesture, however small, was insignificant, and the miscalculation of sentiment could ripple outward, threatening the city's delicate balance. Ideological differences, though subtler, were equally destabilizing. New ideas, circulating quietly through the city, challenged assumptions about leadership, justice, and community life. Some citizens embraced these shifts with curiosity or hope, while others resisted them fiercely, seeing them as a threat to tradition and authority. The resulting friction added a layer of tension that was harder to measure but no less powerful. Every discussion, every public decision was now filtered through these competing frameworks, complicating governance and demanding nuanced understanding. In this environment, leaders were constantly balancing competing pressures, striving to maintain order without overextending authority. Public gestures, negotiations, and policies had to satisfy multiple constituencies simultaneously, and missteps could amplify existing fractures. The very act of governing became an exercise in delicate tension, where success depended as much on perception and subtle influence as on tangible resources or enforcement. Holding the center required attentiveness to both the visible and the unseen, to relationships that were explicit and those only implied. For Abu Sufyan, the weight of these fractures was deeply personal. While he relied on advisors, allies, and loyal supporters, ultimate responsibility rested with him. Every compromise, every decision to favor one side over another, carried consequences for his standing, the city's stability, and the lives of those who followed him. The pressure of maintaining unity amidst economic rivalries, tribal disputes, and ideological debates was unrelenting. Even small failures were magnified, not just in public perception, but in the calculus of future alliances and trust. The city's fractures were a constant reminder that leadership was never just about power or wealth. It was about navigating human ambition, fear, and hope simultaneously. Abu Sufyan's role demanded endurance, foresight, and the ability to act decisively while remaining sensitive to the intricate web of relationships that defined Mecca. Each day, each decision was a test of judgment, a measure of resilience, and a reflection of the personal burdens that accompanied command. As Mecca's streets thrived with life yet simmered with tension, the broader challenge became clear. Maintaining cohesion required more than authority. It required vigilance, patience, and an understanding of human complexity. For Abu Sufyan, the city's fractures were never abstract. They were a daily pressing reality, shaping his choices and deepening the weight of personal responsibility that he bore at the center of it all. The fractures of the city, subtle and overt, were never far from Abu Sufyan's mind. As he guided negotiations, weighed alliances, and managed the competing pressures of Mecca, he was acutely aware that his responsibilities were inseparable from his family's name. In a city where reputation shaped every interaction, leadership was not just a personal burden. It was a reflection of generations, and every action was observed, judged, and remembered. From an early age, Abu Sufyan had known that belonging to a prominent clan meant scrutiny was constant. Childhood lessons in decorum and strategy were less about play and more about preparing for a lifetime under watchful eyes. Every word, every gesture, and every decision could carry meaning beyond the moment, shaping the perception of the family for decades. Small mistakes, easily overlooked by an ordinary household, could become lasting stains on a lineage whose influence depended on respect, authority, and the appearance of strength. The weight of expectation was relentless. Achievements were celebrated not just as personal successes, but as reflections of the clan's continued prominence. Failures were magnified, dissected, and remembered in council halls and marketplaces alike. The pressure to uphold honor was both internal and external. Internal, because pride and self-awareness demanded high standards. External, because rivals and allies alike monitored behavior, ready to exploit any lapse in judgment. Life in a prominent family was a continual balancing act, where confidence had to coexist with caution and ambition with prudence. Social interactions were never neutral. A handshake, a gesture of generosity, or a carefully worded statement could signal allegiance, influence, or rivalry. Public perception shaped private decisions, and private choices often carried public consequences. Even among friends or family, one misstep could ripple outward, affecting negotiations, loyalty, and the subtle power dynamics that underpinned leadership. Growing up under such scrutiny taught patience, observation, and the ability to anticipate how actions would be interpreted by multiple audiences simultaneously. This constant observation extended to every arena of life, including economic activity. A family's reputation influenced trade, alliances, and the willingness of merchants or clans to honor agreements. Success in business could enhance status and open doors to powerful connections, while mismanagement could erode trust and invite criticism. Wealth was not merely a measure of success. It was a tool, a symbol, and a responsibility, requiring careful stewardship to protect both the family's influence and the city's confidence in its leadership. The knowledge that every move reflected on generations past and those yet to come added another layer of complexity. Abu Sufyan learned early that prudence often mattered as much as courage, and perception could be as powerful as action. Leadership was inseparable from legacy, and every decision carried weight beyond immediate outcomes. Even small choices, whether to intervene in a dispute, lend support to a venture, or extend mercy, were filtered through the lens of family honor. By the time he reached adulthood, Abu Sufyan's understanding of scrutiny and responsibility had become second nature. He approached negotiations, alliances, and public appearances with awareness of both immediate consequences and long-term implications. The family name he carried was both a shield and a source of pressure, granting influence while demanding vigilance. Success and survival depended on managing perception as carefully as strategy, and failure was a lesson that could reverberate far beyond a single lifetime. This intimate connection between personal action, family reputation, and societal expectation naturally flowed into the economic pressures that defined Mecca. Maintaining wealth, managing trade, and navigating financial rivalries were inseparable from the honor and legacy that a prominent clan carried. The next challenge was to reconcile public responsibility with economic realities, ensuring that the family name remained respected, trusted, and secure amidst both opportunity and risk. The weight of a family name, visible in every decision and scrutinized in every interaction, was closely tied to another, more tangible form of responsibility: the city's economic lifeblood. In Mecca, wealth and reputation were inseparable from trade. What the family managed, protected, or lost in commerce could ripple outward, affecting alliances, loyalty, and influence. Even the most careful stewardship could be undone by forces beyond control: storms on the desert routes, political tensions with neighboring tribes, or unexpected disruptions in supply. The stability of Mecca's markets was never guaranteed, and when trade faltered, the consequences were immediate and profound. Trade was more than commerce. It was survival, influence, and prestige intertwined. Caravans carried goods across deserts, connecting Mecca to distant cities and sustaining both the economy and social networks. Merchants relied on predictable routes, cooperative neighbors, and careful planning. But even a minor interruption could cascade into broader instability. A delayed shipment could spark disputes, erode trust, or create shortages that affected everything from market prices to personal relationships. For leaders like Abu Sufyan, the responsibility to safeguard these channels of commerce was constant, demanding vigilance and foresight. Political instability amplified these economic pressures. Shifting loyalties among tribes, disputes over territory, or rival ambitions in neighboring regions could disrupt trade networks without warning. Alliances, once considered secure, could unravel, and merchants could find themselves negotiating not only for profit, but for protection and survival. The intricate web connecting wealth, influence, and loyalty meant that economic disruptions were not just financial. They were social and political challenges that reverberated across the city. Environmental challenges added another layer of danger. Harsh desert conditions, unpredictable weather, and treacherous terrain transformed routine journeys into high-stakes ventures. Caravans could be slowed or scattered by storms, their supplies vulnerable to spoilage or theft. Every shipment required careful preparation, with routes planned for both efficiency and safety. A failure to account for the desert's unpredictability could imperil merchants, soldiers assigned to protect goods, and the broader networks that depended on timely arrivals. When trade faltered, Mecca itself felt the strain. Marketplaces became tense, negotiations grew cautious, and disputes over resources intensified. Families and clans whose influence depended on commerce found themselves vulnerable, and even minor delays or losses could affect long-term alliances. The economic rhythm of the city was deeply intertwined with social and political stability. When one faltered, the others wavered. Leaders had to act decisively to protect trade, mediate disputes, and reassure both citizens and allies that Mecca's lifeblood could continue to flow. For Abu Sufyan, maintaining this balance required constant awareness of both immediate threats and distant risks. Each caravan, each contract, and each negotiation carried implications for security, reputation, and loyalty. The economic pressures of the city were inseparable from the personal and familial responsibilities he carried. Success meant not only preserving wealth, but sustaining confidence in his leadership and in the broader stability of Mecca. Failure could compromise not only commerce, but alliances, honor, and social cohesion. The fragility of trade underscored a broader reality. Survival in Mecca required foresight, adaptability, and a willingness to confront dangers that were often invisible until they struck. Political tensions, rival ambitions, and environmental hazards were constant threats, and safeguarding commerce demanded more than skill. It required vigilance, courage, and an understanding of the intricate connections that held the city together. As the city prepared for the movement of goods across deserts, leaders and merchants alike became acutely aware of the dangers inherent in travel. Caravans were not merely vessels of profit, they were lifelines that could be imperiled by bandits, harsh terrain, or unforeseen events. The next challenge would reveal the human cost and strategic complexity of navigating these risks, highlighting how every journey carried both opportunity and peril. The lifeblood of Mecca, carried in caravans across the harsh desert, was never guaranteed. Even the most carefully planned trade routes exposed merchants, guards, and leaders alike to constant danger. The failure of a single journey could ripple across the city, undermining confidence, disrupting alliances, and threatening both wealth and reputation. For Abu Sufyan and those responsible for overseeing commerce, every departure of a caravan was a test of foresight, preparation, and nerve. Desert journeys were grueling, both physically and mentally. The vast stretches of sand and rock offered no shelter, no certainty, and no mercy for miscalculation. Travelers faced the sun's relentless heat by day, freezing winds by night, and the ever-present threat of sandstorms that could erase paths and bury supplies. Bandits were a constant shadow on the horizon, and rival tribes could see an opportunity in the slightest weakness. Even the most experienced guides knew that no plan could fully account for the unpredictability of the desert. Every step carried risk, and every decision had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical challenges. Leaders and caravan guards carried the weight of responsibility for men, goods, and alliances. Anxiety accompanied each night by the fire, every unexpected sound prompting a careful check of the perimeter. The fear of being unprepared was compounded by the awareness that a single mistake could not only destroy a caravan, but also compromise the city's broader economic and political stability. Sleep was shallow, interrupted, and never fully restorative. Every dream carried echoes of potential disaster, and every waking moment was sharpened by vigilance. Even when the path was clear, uncertainty remained. Decisions about when to travel, which routes to take, and how to ration supplies were constant dilemmas. Leaders had to balance speed with caution, protection with efficiency, and morale with practical necessity. The tension was unrelenting. The desert did not forgive hesitation, nor did it reward carelessness. Each choice was a measure of skill, endurance, and the ability to anticipate hazards that were often invisible until they struck. For Abu Sufyan, overseeing these journeys was more than logistics. It was a test of judgment and resilience. Every caravan departure carried reputational weight. Merchants, allies, and rival clans observed not only the outcomes, but the decisions leading up to them. A lost shipment could weaken trust, embolden opponents, and create political friction. Conversely, a successful return reinforced confidence in leadership, strengthened alliances, and maintained the flow of commerce that sustained the city's social and economic networks. The dangers of travel highlighted the interconnectedness of Mecca's survival. Economic stability, political influence, and social cohesion were tied to the ability to move goods safely across unpredictable terrain. Leadership demanded not only foresight and strategy, but also the capacity to manage fear, both one's own and that of those entrusted to follow. The desert journey became a crucible, revealing character, judgment, and the fragility of human planning in the face of natural and human hazards. These constant risks also underscored the importance of diplomacy. Negotiations with neighboring tribes, alliances with distant merchants, and the careful management of rivalries were essential to ensure safe passage. No caravan could travel in isolation. Trust and mutual interest created a buffer against danger, and even then, caution remained paramount. The success of trade routes depended not only on preparation and endurance, but on relationships maintained across vast distances, balancing respect, negotiation, and strategic calculation. As Mecca relied on these lifelines for wealth and influence, it became clear that safeguarding trade was inseparable from political skill. Each journey into the desert was also a journey into the complex world of diplomacy, where alliances had to be nurtured, rivalries managed, and trust continually reinforced. The challenges of travel and the dangers of the desert were never merely logistical. They were deeply entwined with the broader strategies that sustained the city, shaping both opportunity and survival. The desert journeys, fraught with danger and uncertainty, revealed a truth that reached far beyond the boundaries of sand and stone. Survival depended not only on preparation and endurance, but on relationships carefully cultivated. Every caravan that reached Mecca intact was a testament to strategy, foresight, and the ability to navigate not just terrain, but the complex web of human interaction. In a city where every alliance, agreement, and promise carried weight, words became as critical as weapons, shaping outcomes, preserving life, and preventing disaster. Negotiation in Mecca was a delicate art. Leaders like Abu Sufyan understood that a single misworded statement could unravel hours of planning, offend a key ally, or inflame a rival. Persuasion was never merely about convincing another party. It was about reading intent, anticipating reaction, and crafting language that carried authority without arrogance, clarity without insult. Every conversation, was layered with meaning, and even silence could be interpreted as approval or dissent. Communication was not casual. It was strategic, precise, and inescapably consequential. Conflict avoidance was equally important. Open confrontation was costly and unpredictable, and even minor disputes could escalate rapidly into broader hostilities. Leaders had to identify potential points of friction, mediate tensions, and craft compromises that maintained loyalty while safeguarding honor. The most successful negotiators were those who could balance firmness with tact, demonstrating strength without provoking unnecessary aggression. In Mecca, diplomacy was not an abstract skill. It was a vital survival tool, tested daily in council halls, marketplaces, and even casual conversations. Miscommunication carried particular danger. A misunderstood gesture, a poorly phrased assurance, or an unintentional slight could ignite suspicion, provoke rivalry, or disrupt trade. The intricacies of language and etiquette were as vital as any physical preparation for battle, because relationships were the scaffolding on which both commerce and authority depended. Leaders spent hours considering not only what to say, but how to say it, when to speak, and to whom, knowing that perception could alter outcomes as dramatically as action. Persuasion and negotiation extended beyond immediate concerns. Long-term alliances required careful cultivation, a deep understanding of personalities, and the ability to navigate competing ambitions. Even seemingly minor promises had the potential to shift loyalties, and trust could be fragile, easily undermined by rumors, oversight, or impatience. Words were wielded with care because they carried the power to strengthen bonds or sever them permanently. The stakes were immense, and the cost of failure could echo across the city and the region beyond. The reliance on language and diplomacy also revealed the fragility of peace. Even in moments of calm, tribal rivalries simmered beneath the surface, ready to flare if mismanaged. Negotiation, persuasion, and conflict avoidance were daily necessities, yet each interaction contained the possibility of misstep. Leaders had to remain vigilant, discerning subtle cues and understanding the motivations that could transform minor disagreements into lasting enmities. Words became shields, swords, and bridges, depending on how they were employed and received. Abu Sufyan's skill in navigating these complexities was not only a reflection of intelligence and experience, but also of necessity. In a city where trade, reputation, and alliances intersected constantly, diplomacy determined survival as much as strategy or military strength. Each successful negotiation reinforced influence, protected commerce, and prevented disputes from erupting into violence. Conversely, a poorly handled conversation could destabilize relationships, weaken loyalty, and intensify tribal tensions. The constant need for careful communication and strategic persuasion illuminated a broader reality. The city's stability rested as much on the management of human relationships as on economic or military strength. Words, chosen and timed with precision, became the first line of defense against chaos. And as negotiations were conducted, promises made, and assurances repeated, it became increasingly clear that Mecca's future depended on leaders who could wield language with the same skill, precision, and foresight as a master wielded a blade. This reliance on dialogue and persuasion naturally led into the complex web of tribal rivalries, where alliances were fragile, grudges ran deep, and the slightest misstep could ignite conflict that even the sharpest words might struggle to contain. The power of words, carefully chosen and measured, was constantly tested in Mecca, where even a single misstatement could inflame simmering tensions. Diplomacy kept the city stable for now, but beneath the surface, rivalries quietly persisted. Generations of competition, jealousy, and past offenses had left deep marks across clans and families. In a place where honor was sacred and memory long, grudges lingered like shadows, ready to influence decisions, alliances, and daily interactions. Arabian tribes were defined by these long memories. A dispute over trade, a slight against a relative, or a perceived insult could echo for decades, shaping relationships far beyond the original conflict. Families meticulously remembered who had supported whom, who had been wronged, and who had profited at another's expense. Even minor incidents could resurface unexpectedly, rekindling rivalries that had seemed dormant, and leaders had to anticipate these latent tensions in every negotiation, alliance, and public decision. For Abu Sufyan and other Meccan leaders, navigating these rivalries was a daily challenge. Every alliance had its conditions, every negotiation a historical backdrop. Even when parties appeared willing to cooperate, past grievances could complicate agreements or undermine trust. Mediating disputes often required delicate balancing acts, acknowledging past slights without amplifying resentment, offering concessions without appearing weak, and reinforcing loyalty without provoking retaliation. A single misstep could unravel months of diplomacy and threaten the city's fragile cohesion. Rivalries were not limited to personal or familial matters. They extended into commerce, politics, and access to resources. Competing claims over trade routes, market dominance, and influence within councils created a constant undercurrent of tension. Leaders had to assess not only the overt actions of rivals, but also the subtle undercurrents of intention, suspicion, and strategy. Understanding tribal psychology became as critical as understanding geography, because the choices of one family or clan could ripple across the city, creating both opportunity and danger. The persistence of grudges also shaped military and strategic decisions. Past conflicts influenced loyalties in times of crisis, determined who would support an ally in battle, and dictated responses to threats. Generational memory meant that alliances were fragile, contingent, and always open to reevaluation. Even the most promising agreements required constant reinforcement, careful communication, and attention to historical context. Leaders could not afford to treat relationships as static. They had to be managed, nurtured, and monitored continuously. These rivalries illuminated the broader reality of regional politics. Mecca did not exist in isolation. Its leaders had to consider the ambitions, loyalties, and grievances of neighboring tribes, cities, and emerging powers. Decisions within the city could reverberate far beyond its walls, influencing trade, diplomacy, and security across the Arabian Peninsula. The web of alliances and rivalries extended outward, and a misjudged step in Mecca could have consequences hundreds of miles away. Abu Sufyan's awareness of these dynamics shaped both his strategies and his perspective on leadership. Managing rivalries required not only negotiation and diplomacy, but also foresight, psychological insight, and patience. Every interaction, public or private, carried historical weight, and every decision could shift the balance of influence across multiple generations. Success depended on understanding both the immediate pressures and the deep-rooted memories that guided behavior, loyalty, and expectation as the city contended with its internal rivalries. It became clear that Mecca's stability was inseparable from the broader political landscape. Leadership demanded attention to both micro-level conflicts and macro-level relationships, connecting the management of personal, familial, and tribal tensions to the shifting alliances, ambitions, and power struggles that defined the region. The challenges of local rivalries naturally extended into the complex arena of regional politics, where diplomacy, influence, and strategic calculation would determine not only survival, but dominance. While internal rivalries demanded constant vigilance, Mecca did not exist in isolation. Beyond its walls stretched a landscape of competing powers, each driven by ambition, resource needs, and centuries of political momentum. Rome and Persia cast long shadows over Arabia. Their influence felt even in seemingly small decisions, while neighboring tribes jostled for advantage, often leveraging external pressures to strengthen their own positions. Leadership in this environment meant navigating a complex web of threats and opportunities, where every choice could reverberate across borders and generations. The presence of powerful empires magnified the stakes of local decisions. Rome, with its vast military and economic reach, projected influence across the region through both direct encounters and alliances with intermediary leaders. Persia's reach was equally significant, and its interactions with Arabian tribes could tip the balance of power in unpredictable ways. Even without direct intervention, the knowledge that these distant forces were monitoring trade, alliances, and regional movements shaped the strategies of Mecca's leadership. Diplomacy and caution became inseparable, because missteps could invite consequences far beyond the city's walls. Neighboring Arabian tribes were equally formidable in their own right. Long-standing rivalries, shifting loyalties, and ambitions for local dominance meant that alliances were often fragile and negotiations continuous. Leaders had to weigh the intentions of each tribe, consider historical grievances, and anticipate both cooperation and exploitation. A single error could be used by rivals to challenge authority, disrupt trade, or destabilize carefully maintained relationships. The region was a living chessboard, and every move required foresight, patience, and calculation. Trade, as ever, was central to strategy. The flow of goods, wealth, and information connected Mecca to distant markets and political networks. But these lifelines were vulnerable to both human and environmental forces. Caravan routes could be intercepted, markets disrupted, or alliances undermined by those seeking advantage. The city's prosperity and the power of its leaders depended on maintaining these channels while anticipating the maneuvers of outside powers. Economic strength and political influence were intertwined, reinforcing the need for careful attention to both. Navigating this environment demanded a unique blend of skills, foresight, negotiation, and the ability to anticipate both immediate and long-term consequences. Leaders had to constantly assess not only the intentions of empires and tribes, but also the ripple effects of every decision on trade, alliances, and internal stability. Misjudgment could carry both political and personal consequences, threatening authority, wealth, and even the lives of those within the city. Success was measured not merely by immediate gains, but by sustained stability and influence amid constant uncertainty. For Abu Sufyan, the external pressures compounded the personal burdens he carried. Responsibility for his family's name, the city's wealth, and the lives of men under his command merged with the necessity of anticipating actions far beyond Mecca. Every decision was filtered through layers of obligation, history, and strategic calculation. The weight of these intersecting pressures left little room for rest, reflection, or certainty. Even when visible threats were absent, the mental and emotional toll was relentless. The combination of internal rivalries, economic volatility, and regional pressures created a crucible for leadership. Abu Sufyan faced a world in which survival and success depended on the careful alignment of diplomacy, strategy, and personal judgment. Each day brought new challenges, testing his endurance, resilience, and ability to reconcile conflicting demands. The city's fate and his family's reputation rested on choices made in council chambers, marketplaces, and caravan routes alike. Amid these relentless pressures, the personal struggle became inseparable from political responsibility. Leadership was not only a test of strategy and negotiation, it was a trial of endurance, patience, and the ability to carry burdens that extended beyond the self. Every decision, every compromise, and every calculated risk reflected not only the needs of Mecca, but the character and resilience of those who bore ultimate responsibility. The pressures of external powers and the delicate balance of regional alliances were ever present. Yet for Abu Sufyan, the greatest burden remained the responsibility he carried for his own people. Leadership was not merely about strategy or diplomacy. It was the unrelenting weight of knowing that the lives, safety, and futures of an entire tribe depended on his judgment. Each decision, each compromise, and each command carried consequences that could ripple through generations. The city's survival, the clan's honor, and the stability of relationships all rested upon his ability to navigate an intricate, often unforgiving landscape. Worry was constant. Every rumor of unrest, every shift in loyalty, and every report from distant routes demanded attention and reflection. Leaders could not allow themselves the luxury of ignoring potential threats or assuming goodwill. Even small signs of discord required consideration, for a minor miscalculation might escalate into a crisis that endangered the tribe or destabilized the city. This vigilance extended to every corner of life. Disputes between families, resource allocation, trade agreements, and alliances with neighbors all demanded careful oversight. Leadership was a full-time wait, without pause or relief. Choices were rarely simple. Every action had consequences that could be anticipated but never fully controlled. Decisions about defense, negotiation, or economic strategy required balancing short-term needs against long-term stability, and the wrong move could undermine confidence or spark conflict. Even successes carried hidden costs. A tactical victory might inflame rivalries. A well-negotiated agreement could provoke envy, and a profitable trade deal might strain relationships elsewhere. Each judgment demanded foresight, restraint, and a continual reassessment of priorities. Sleepless nights became routine. Abu Sufyan's mind never fully rested, replaying decisions, anticipating outcomes, and calculating risks. The burden of leadership was not limited to visible action. It extended into private reflection, moments of doubt, and the relentless questioning of choices. Sleep, when it came, was often fragmented, filled with the echoes of what-ifs and the subtle pressures of responsibility. The quiet hours became a crucible for thought, forcing consideration of every variable and contingency, whether practical, political, or personal. The weight of responsibility also meant personal sacrifice. Freedom of movement, spontaneity, and leisure were luxuries that leaders could rarely afford. Every interaction was scrutinized, every conversation a potential strategic move, and every absence a risk to perception or influence. Leadership demanded attention to both grand strategy and the smallest details, from family dynamics to the behavior of followers. The role required constant awareness, with little margin for error or rest. With all these pressures came emotional isolation. Decisions were ultimately his alone, and the responsibility for their outcomes could not be shared. Advisors, allies, and family could offer counsel, but the final judgment rested squarely on the leader. The solitude of authority was amplified by the knowledge that mistakes could endanger lives, reputations, and the tribe's standing. Confidence, courage, and clarity of judgment were essential, but they were tempered by the persistent awareness of risk and consequence. Yet within this burden lay a form of resilience. Enduring constant worry, sleepless nights, and the weight of responsibility forged an acute awareness of human behavior, a sharper understanding of strategy, and a capacity for measured decision-making. Leadership demanded both endurance and adaptability, a balance of vigilance and foresight that was honed under relentless pressure. Each challenge reinforced the importance of careful observation, prudent planning, and emotional discipline. As the city and its people looked to him for guidance, Abu Sufyan carried the knowledge that leadership was as much a psychological and moral trial as it was a strategic one. The constant weight of responsibility, the unending scrutiny, and the perpetual demands of decision-making shaped not only the survival of his tribe, but the very nature of his character. And as these pressures mounted, they naturally gave way to the profound solitude of leadership, where emotional isolation became an inseparable companion to duty, loyalty, and authority. The constant vigilance, sleepless nights, and unrelenting responsibility of leadership left Abu Sufyan carrying burdens that few could understand. In public, he projected strength, decisiveness, and confidence. The image required to maintain loyalty, command respect, and navigate the shifting alliances of Mecca. Behind the carefully maintained facade, however, was a profound solitude, a quiet awareness that the very authority he wielded also separated him from those he led. The higher one rose, the thinner the line between influence and isolation became, and the greater the distance between public perception and private reality. Authority demanded visibility and presence. Every decision was observed, every command dissected, and every word weighed. To falter in appearance could embolden rivals, unsettle allies, or erode trust. In council chambers, marketplaces, and negotiations, Abu Sufyan had to display confidence even when uncertainty gnawed at him. He had to inspire loyalty, reassure allies, and maintain control, all while carrying an internal ledger of worries, doubts, and possible consequences. Public strength was a performance, but one with tangible stakes. It could not be feigned lightly or abandoned. Private isolation, by contrast, was inescapable. Counsel could guide but not absolve. Advice could inform but not decide. And loyalty could comfort but not relieve. The ultimate responsibility rested solely on him, and with it came the persistent awareness that any misstep, no matter how small, could ripple across the city and beyond. This solitude was both practical and emotional. Practical, because leaders had to make final judgments, and emotional, because the pressures of authority demanded restraint, calculation, and careful management of both their own and others' expectations. The gap between public authority and private isolation created a subtle tension. Successes were celebrated widely, yet the personal toll remained invisible. Failures, real or imagined, were quietly internalized, their weight magnified in the stillness of private reflection. Moments of respite were often fleeting, overshadowed by the persistent calculations of potential risks and contingencies. Trust could be extended, but never without caution. Intimacy was rare, for vulnerability might compromise the authority on which the tribe relied. Leadership was thus both a position of honor and a cage, confining the mind and spirit to constant awareness. Even within the family, the burden of leadership created distance. Generational expectations, public scrutiny, and internal pressures meant that Abu Sufyan's role could not be fully shared or lightly explained. Relationships were filtered through the lens of responsibility. Guidance had to be measured, support carefully balanced, and personal expression moderated to maintain authority. Love, loyalty, and camaraderie existed, but always within the constraints of the office and the inseparable public image it required. This loneliness was compounded by the unpredictability of the world around him. Internal rivalries, tribal grievances, economic volatility, and external threats all demanded constant vigilance. Every alliance had to be nurtured, every promise carefully tracked, and every potential conflict anticipated. The public image of control and calm belied the relentless mental and emotional labor required to maintain it. Authority was inseparable from solitude, and solitude became an inevitable companion to the highest responsibilities. Yet, the isolation also sharpened perception and judgment. Time alone allowed reflection, analysis, and strategic foresight. It was in solitude that decisions were weighed, risks measured, and contingencies imagined. The quiet gave leaders the clarity to anticipate threats, understand human behavior, and navigate the complexities of a city and region in constant flux. The gap between public strength and private reflection became both a challenge and a tool, shaping leaders who could bear the weight of responsibility while safeguarding the trust of those who relied on them. As Mecca's leaders maintained their public composure, the fragile equilibrium they upheld was increasingly threatened. The city's internal rivalries, economic dependencies, and regional pressures continued to simmer, and even the most skillful projection of authority could not halt the currents of instability rising beneath the surface. The solitude that accompanied leadership was now paired with the looming reality that the world around them was becoming ever more unpredictable, setting the stage for growing tension and upheaval. The solitude of leadership and the careful maintenance of public strength offered no guarantees against the world beyond one's immediate control. Even the most vigilant governance could not shield Mecca from the persistent churn of instability. Each passing year brought new challenges: shifts in alliances, disputes among tribes, unpredictable weather affecting trade, and the slow, creeping consequences of past decisions. The city's equilibrium was fragile, and maintaining it demanded constant attention, judgment, and foresight. Daily life in Mecca was shaped by this ongoing turbulence. Markets, while bustling, were sensitive to fluctuations in supply and demand, to caravan disruptions, and to the political maneuverings of neighboring tribes. Merchants and families lived with the knowledge that fortunes could change suddenly, and even routine exchanges carried risk. Children learned early that the city's prosperity was never guaranteed, that negotiations and alliances were as crucial as labor and trade, and that stability was a temporary gift rather than a permanent condition. Regional pressures amplified these uncertainties. Neighboring tribes pursued their own interests, occasionally collaborating, often competing, and always monitoring opportunities for advantage. The ambitions of distant powers, Rome, Persia, and others, added layers of complexity, creating a landscape where decisions had ripple effects far beyond Mecca's borders. Caravans were not merely economic ventures, but strategic exercises, requiring negotiation, protection, and anticipation of political currents. The city's survival depended on an intricate balance between internal cohesion and external diplomacy. Economic disruptions further complicated life. Seasonal changes, desert hazards, or trade disputes could quickly undermine local prosperity. Even when trade returned to normal, the echoes of previous interruptions lingered in cautious merchants, hesitant alliances, and the reputations of those responsible for maintaining stability. For leaders, this meant that every decision had to account for both immediate consequences and potential long-term repercussions. A failed agreement or mismanaged negotiation could weaken authority, embolden rivals, or disrupt the social and economic networks that supported the city. For Abu Sufyan, the accumulation of these pressures was both professional and personal. Responsibility extended beyond mere governance. It encompassed the welfare, loyalty, and security of the tribe. Each year brought not only new external challenges, but also the continuous need to anticipate internal conflicts, manage alliances, and reinforce trust. Leadership demanded endurance, adaptability, and the ability to reconcile competing priorities under the relentless weight of consequence. The constant arrival of new conflicts created a sense of temporal pressure, as if the city were caught in a cycle that could not be paused or avoided. Old disputes resurfaced just as new challenges emerged, creating a layered landscape of tension. Even routine matters, trade agreements, dispute resolution, or ceremonial obligations required careful consideration, for the smallest oversight could trigger wider instability. Life in Mecca was defined by the necessity of constant vigilance, the management of both expected and unforeseen crises, and the need to remain one step ahead of shifting threats. Yet these recurring challenges also forged resilience. Leaders honed their judgment, deepened their understanding of human behavior, and developed strategies to maintain authority and cohesion despite uncertainty. Each conflict tested alliances, revealed weaknesses, and demanded creative solutions. Over time, this crucible of repeated challenges shaped not only the leaders themselves, but the character of the city, reinforcing the importance of foresight, adaptability, and decisiveness. The passage of years under such pressure made one truth clear: stability was never permanent, and preparedness was never complete. Each resolved dispute merely set the stage for the next challenge, and each negotiation, victory, or compromise carried seeds of future conflict. The city and its leaders lived in a delicate balance, navigating constant instability while cultivating opportunities for prosperity and security. As these cycles of conflict continued, Mecca approached a turning point. The cumulative weight of internal rivalries, economic pressures, and regional instability created conditions that would soon demand unprecedented decisions, decisive leadership, and a careful recalibration of alliances. The era of repeated challenges was reaching a moment that could redefine the city's trajectory, marking the threshold of a new, transformative period. Years of relentless pressure, repeated conflicts, and the constant balancing of alliances had prepared Abu Sufyan for the challenges of leadership. Yet even he could not have anticipated the scale of change sweeping through Mecca and beyond. The city, once defined by tradition, stability, and the predictable rhythms of trade and tribal life, began to feel the tremors of a world in transformation. Social norms, political structures, and even spiritual landscapes were shifting, creating a sense of both opportunity and profound uncertainty. Leaders and citizens alike sensed that the patterns they had relied upon for generations were no longer as reliable as they once seemed. Social dynamics evolved rapidly. Generations accustomed to strict hierarchies and familiar customs found themselves negotiating new ideas, new alliances, and new forms of interaction. Younger voices began asserting influence in ways that had previously been rare, and new social networks, fueled by trade, migration, and emerging ideas, challenged the traditional order. For Abu Sufyan, this meant recalibrating leadership, adapting strategies to account for shifting loyalties, and maintaining authority, while recognizing the changing expectations of the population. Stability required flexibility, and flexibility demanded both foresight and courage. Political structures were under pressure as well. The balance of power among tribes, families, and emerging leaders was increasingly volatile. Long-standing alliances were tested by new ambitions, and rivalries that had simmered quietly for decades now influenced major decisions. The interplay of local dynamics with regional pressures from distant empires amplified uncertainty, forcing leaders to anticipate shifts not only in the city, but across the Arabian Peninsula. Every negotiation, every strategic choice, had consequences far beyond immediate circumstances, and misjudgment could prove costly. Spiritual currents, though invisible, also contributed to the sense of change. Communities were reconsidering long-standing practices, beliefs, and relationships, often in response to wider social and political shifts. While sacred boundaries remained respected, the presence of new ideas and emerging movements altered the context in which leadership, commerce, and daily life operated. The city's pulse was changing, and those in positions of authority had to navigate the subtle but profound ways these shifts affected perception, loyalty, and cohesion. Abu Sufyan's awareness of these transformations shaped both his public and private conduct. In council halls and marketplaces, he projected confidence, decisiveness, and the appearance of control. Yet privately, he could not ignore the implications of a rapidly changing environment. Each decision required careful consideration, weighing not only immediate outcomes, but also potential ripple effects across generations, alliances, and the evolving social landscape. Leadership demanded constant recalibration, a delicate balance between tradition and adaptation. The era's rapid changes also intensified personal pressures. Leaders were required to anticipate the unexpected, reconcile competing interests, and act decisively in situations where outcomes were far from certain. Every choice carried heightened consequences, for in a time of transformation, yesterday's solutions were no longer guaranteed to work tomorrow. Vigilance, foresight, and adaptability became not just virtues, but necessities. Yet amid this transformation, the city retained elements of continuity. Trade, familial honor, and communal cohesion remained essential pillars, even as their contexts shifted. The challenge was to navigate change without losing the stability that had long sustained Mecca, balancing the forces of tradition with the pressures of a world in flux. Leadership required both skill and intuition, blending calculated strategy with the ability to sense the currents of change before they became irreversible. As Abu Sufyan observed the unfolding transformations, it became clear that uncertainty had become a defining feature of the era. Every decision, alliance, and negotiation carried amplified weight, and the world he had known was giving way to new realities. The city, the region, and even the social fabric of his generation were poised on the edge of profound shifts, where leadership would be tested not only by immediate pressures, but by the unpredictability of a changing world. As the world around Mecca shifted, every decision Abu Sufyan made carried a heightened sense of consequence. Nothing could be taken for granted, and even the smallest misstep could ripple outward in ways that threatened alliances, trade, and the stability of the tribe. Leadership had always demanded careful calculation, but in an era of sweeping change, every choice felt like a gamble, with stakes that extended far beyond immediate outcomes. The pressure was relentless, and the cost of error loomed larger than ever. The fear of choosing wrong infiltrated every aspect of daily life. Plans for trade caravans, negotiations with neighboring tribes, or even responses to internal disputes were weighed against a backdrop of uncertainty. Leaders could anticipate threats, but they could not control all variables. Decisions were made with incomplete information, and even the most careful strategies could fail due to unforeseen circumstances. The tension between necessity and risk was constant, shaping not only public conduct, but private thought as well. This heightened scrutiny made every interaction a potential test. Words, gestures, and decisions were observed and interpreted by allies, rivals, and the general population. Miscommunication could inflame a simmering rivalry, while hesitation might be perceived as weakness. Even success was tempered by caution. The knowledge that circumstances could change overnight made celebration measured and fleeting. Leaders had to be alert, decisive, and yet prepared to adjust instantly if events diverged from expectations. The psychological burden of this constant vigilance was profound. Abu Sufyan carried not only the responsibility of guiding the tribe through external pressures, but also the mental weight of knowing that every choice might fail. Nights were restless with replayed scenarios, imagined consequences, and careful consideration of potential outcomes. Each moment of indecision or misjudgment was magnified, and even fleeting doubts could feel catastrophic in the broader context of survival and influence. This pervasive fear of error also shaped strategic thinking. Leaders had to consider contingencies, anticipate rivals' moves, and plan for disruptions far beyond their immediate control. Every decision required layers of assessment, from practical logistics to the subtleties of human behavior and alliance dynamics. The calculus of choice became both a skill and a burden. The ability to weigh competing factors, to predict consequences, and to act decisively was essential. Yet it came at the cost of constant mental and emotional strain. Personal introspection became an inevitable refuge. The private hours offered space to process decisions, reflect on outcomes, and confront the inner weight of responsibility. In solitude, leaders could examine motives, reassess judgments, and consider the alignment between personal values and public duty. These moments of reflection were essential, not only for decision-making, but for preserving a sense of clarity and self amid unrelenting external pressures. The mind became a battlefield, balancing strategic foresight with the emotional toll of leadership. The fear of choosing wrong was inseparable from the role itself. Authority and responsibility amplified stakes, making errors both highly visible and deeply consequential. Yet this pressure also forged resilience, sharpened judgment, and strengthened the capacity for measured action. The challenge was to navigate uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, to act decisively while remaining adaptable, and to reconcile the demands of public duty with private conscience. As Abu Sufyan confronted the high-stakes nature of every choice, the line between leadership and personal introspection blurred. The burden of responsibility and the fear of error demanded reflection, self-awareness, and a profound understanding of both human nature and the unpredictability of the world. In these quiet moments, the weight of command and the necessity of careful judgment converged, shaping not only the fate of the tribe, but the character of the leader himself. The relentless uncertainty, the high stakes of every decision, and the constant vigilance required by leadership inevitably drove Abu Sufyan inward. Amid the external pressures of trade, diplomacy, and tribal rivalries, the quiet hours offered space for reflection, regret, and the careful weighing of choices made under duress. These private moments were a stark contrast to the public persona of authority and confidence, revealing the human cost of guiding a tribe through a world in flux. Regret often accompanied reflection. Some decisions, even when necessary, had unintended consequences. Misjudgments in negotiation, delayed responses to threats, or compromises made to maintain peace could haunt the mind long after the immediate danger had passed. Leaders bore these memories alone, aware that hindsight illuminated flaws invisible in the heat of action. Each regret was a lesson, yet also a reminder of the heavy responsibility inherent in every choice. The weight of hindsight added a layer of complexity to the ongoing task of leadership, reinforcing the need for vigilance and careful consideration in every future decision. Reflection also offered clarity. Looking back on years of navigating internal rivalries, external pressures, and constant uncertainty, patterns emerged. Abu Sufyan recognized the subtle dynamics that had shaped outcomes, the importance of timing, the power of measured words, and the fragile balance between strength and diplomacy. These insights were gained at the cost of sleepless nights and endless vigilance. Yet they became an essential part of survival and governance. Understanding the interplay between personal judgment, tribal loyalty, and regional pressures allowed for a more nuanced approach to decision-making and leadership. Amid reflection and regret, there was also a persistent search for stability. The cycles of conflict, economic disruption, and social change created a world in which permanence was rare. Every alliance, every trade route, and every strategic choice existed within shifting currents. The search for stability was not simply the desire for calm, but a necessity. The well-being of the tribe, the security of commerce, and the cohesion of alliances all depended on a degree of predictability and continuity. Stability became both a goal and a guiding principle, shaping priorities and informing choices. This period of introspection was deeply personal. Abu Sufyan grappled not only with the consequences of external events, but with his own role in shaping them. Private reflection allowed him to confront doubt, consider alternative actions, and reconcile personal values with the demands of leadership. These moments reinforced the understanding that leadership was inseparable from personal responsibility, and that the character of the leader was tested as much by private deliberation as by public action. Regret, reflection, and the search for stability were intertwined. Each element informed the others. Regret sharpened insight, reflection guided strategy, and the pursuit of stability shaped both immediate and long-term decisions. The process was continuous, demanding vigilance, humility, and resilience. It was a reminder that leadership was not merely about managing events, but about understanding the human, social, and political forces that shaped them. Through these private contemplations, Abu Sufyan gained perspective on the era he had lived through. He recognized the extraordinary pressures of his position, the relentless pace of change, and the courage required to navigate them. The lessons learned in solitude informed the remaining years of his life, guiding decisions, shaping priorities, and influencing the legacy he would leave behind. As these reflections deepened, the horizon of later life came into view. The focus gradually shifted from managing immediate crises to considering the long-term well-being of the tribe, the sustainability of alliances, and the enduring effects of decisions made under duress. Private introspection became a bridge to the final chapters of leadership and the quieter, more measured responsibilities of maturity, preparing the way for the era that would define Abu Sufyan's later life. Years of leadership, conflict, and relentless responsibility gradually gave way to the perspective that only age can bring. Abu Sufyan had lived through cycles of rivalry, economic uncertainty, and shifting alliances, and the passage of time brought both clarity and new concerns. Experience offered wisdom, revealing patterns and principles that could guide decisions more effectively than youthful instinct alone. Yet age also brought fresh worries about succession, the durability of alliances, and the long-term stability of the tribe in a world still marked by unpredictability. With maturity came a broader perspective on past events. Choices that once felt immediate and pressing could now be viewed within a larger context, revealing lessons about strategy, diplomacy, and human behavior. The mistakes of youth, the miscalculations of early leadership, and the unanticipated consequences of decisions became instructive rather than merely burdensome. Abu Sufyan could discern which patterns were recurring and which were anomalies, allowing him to anticipate challenges with greater nuance and foresight. Wisdom did not erase difficulty, but it sharpened judgment, helping him navigate the same complex landscape with a steadier hand. At the same time, age brought a heightened awareness of vulnerabilities. Physical endurance diminished, and the mental strain of constant vigilance remained ever present. Leadership now required balancing the demands of ongoing responsibility with the recognition of personal limits. Decisions had to account not only for external consequences, but for the capacity to execute them effectively. Delegation, trust, and the cultivation of reliable allies became increasingly essential, as the weight of authority could no longer rest solely on one person's energy and attention. The concerns of older leadership extended to the future of the tribe. Succession became a pressing issue. Who would carry forward the responsibilities of governance, maintain alliances, and protect the clan's interests? Decisions made in this period were informed by both accumulated experience and an acute awareness of what could be lost if care was not taken. Ensuring that the tribe's position remained secure required foresight and the careful nurturing of relationships, skills honed over decades of navigating internal and regional pressures. Despite these new worries, age also brought the ability to approach crises with measured composure. The intensity of earlier years, with their immediate threats and constant emergencies, gave way to more deliberate evaluation of risks and opportunities. Long-term strategy became a guiding principle, informed by the lessons of the past and the realities of the present. Leadership was less about reaction and more about anticipation, less about asserting power in every moment and more about safeguarding the tribe's enduring interests. Yet the world remained unpredictable. Even with wisdom and experience, external pressures from rival tribes, shifting alliances, and economic fluctuations continued to challenge stability. Each year brought new complications, reminding leaders that longevity did not eliminate uncertainty. It only allowed it to be approached with a deeper understanding of context and consequence. Abu Sufyan's perspective, tempered by years of responsibility, emphasized careful calculation, patience, and the cultivation of loyalty as essential tools for navigating a world still prone to upheaval. The balance of age, wisdom, and worry shaped the rhythms of daily life. Public presence, diplomacy, and strategic decisions were tempered by reflection, observation, and the awareness of time's passage. Leadership was no longer solely about commanding action. It became a practice of stewardship, protecting the achievements of the past while preparing for challenges yet to come. The weight of experience allowed insight, but it also amplified the awareness of what could be lost. As the years advanced, the horizon of life narrowed, focusing attention on the enduring impact of one's decisions and the legacy left for future generations. The lessons learned over decades, the strategies, the alliances, the careful negotiations, and the personal sacrifices culminated in a period where wisdom and worry existed side by side, guiding choices with a tempered hand and a vigilant heart. This stage naturally set the path toward the final years, a period in which reflection, legacy, and the enduring responsibilities of leadership would dominate thought, shaping the final chapter of a life lived amid extraordinary turbulence and transformation. After decades of relentless pressure, shifting alliances, and the constant vigilance that defined leadership, Abu Sufyan entered a period of relative calm. The bustling streets of Mecca continued their rhythms of trade, negotiation, and social interaction, yet the pace of his own life had slowed. The endless urgency of earlier years gave way to quieter days, filled with reflection and observation, rather than immediate action. The noise of politics, conflict, and economic fluctuation had not vanished entirely, but it had receded enough to allow a different perspective, a chance to see the city, the tribe, and his own life in a broader, more contemplative light. This calm was not empty. It was heavy with memory and meaning. Every conversation, every decision, and every misstep of the past carried weight, informing the judgments of the present. Abu Sufyan could walk through the city streets and recognize the echoes of decades of leadership, the rivalries he had mediated, the alliances he had forged, and the crises he had survived. The energy of youth had long since faded, replaced by a deliberate, measured approach to life. Still, the responsibilities of guidance and stewardship remained, even if now exercised with the calm authority of experience rather than the urgency of necessity. The atmosphere of this period was both peaceful and introspective. Days were no longer consumed by urgent crises, yet the mind remained active, cataloging past lessons and weighing current realities. Observing the younger generations, Abu Sufyan could sense the continuity of tribal life and the emergence of new leaders. But he also recognized the fragility of the social and political structures he had worked to maintain. Peace, he understood, was never guaranteed. It had to be nurtured, observed, and protected, even in the absence of immediate threats. Private reflection became a constant companion. The quiet offered time to reconcile successes with failures, victories with regrets, and ambition with the realities of life. In these moments, the personal and public merged. The leader and the man reflected together, considering not only the outcomes of decades of decision-making, but also the character those experiences had shaped. There was a profound awareness that while the noise of immediate crises had diminished, the consequences of the past would resonate long after his own life had ended. Relationships took on a new significance. Bonds with family, allies, and members of the tribe were no longer just strategic. They were human. Years of responsibility had demonstrated the importance of trust, loyalty, and understanding. And these principles became central to the quieter days of later life. Observing the next generation, Abu Sufyan could guide without commanding, advise without asserting, and teach without pressure, offering insights drawn from a lifetime of navigating complexity, risk, and uncertainty. Yet even in calm, there was an undercurrent of vigilance. The city, though peaceful in the present, remained part of a broader world still defined by shifting alliances and emerging pressures. Awareness of regional dynamics, trade fluctuations, and potential rivalries persisted, shaping thought and judgment. The lessons of a lifetime, the necessity of foresight, patience, and measured action, remained relevant, even when the urgency of daily crises had passed. This period of quiet also magnified the sense of legacy. With the intensity of active leadership diminished, attention naturally turned to the enduring consequences of decisions made over decades. What would remain of the alliances, trade networks, and social structures he had influenced? How would future generations remember both the triumphs and the hardships? The calm of later life created the space to consider these questions, to weigh their importance, and to act where possible to ensure continuity and stability. The quiet after decades of noise was a time of balance, reflection tempered by vigilance, peace tempered by awareness, and observation tempered by experience. It was a period in which the lessons of a long life could crystallize, offering clarity and perspective. As Abu Sufyan looked forward, the natural focus shifted from managing the present to considering the enduring impact of a lifetime of choices, preparing the way for contemplation of the legacy that would define both the man and the era he had shaped. As Abu Sufyan moved through the quiet rhythms of his later years, it became increasingly clear that history would remember him in ways both fair and incomplete. Public memory has a tendency to simplify, to condense decades of decisions, struggles, and nuance into stories that can be told quickly and easily. The full weight of leadership, the sleepless nights, the private fears, the relentless calculations, and the difficult compromises rarely survives in these summaries. What remained in collective memory was often the image of authority, the outcomes of major events, or the most visible triumphs and failures, leaving much of the human experience behind. This selective recollection, however, is not a matter of injustice, but of the limits of storytelling itself. time compresses events, framing them in ways that are digestible for future generations. The subtleties of negotiation, the careful management of rivalries, and the personal reflections that guided every decision tend to fade, leaving only the contours of public deeds. For Abu Sufyan, this meant that much of what had defined his life, constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and the emotional weight of responsibility, would remain invisible to those who only glimpsed the outward narrative. Yet even as history simplifies, the essence of leadership endures. Decisions that shaped the tribe, the city, and the broader region left tangible marks. Alliances that endured, trade networks that flourished, and social structures that persisted. These outcomes, visible and lasting, became the measure of influence for future generations. While the private struggles and emotional burdens might be forgotten, the consequences of action remained as silent testimony to the complexities of leadership. There is a quiet irony in this process. Those who lived through the full scope of events understand the multiplicity of pressures and the moral ambiguities inherent in every choice. Outsiders, however, often see only outcomes, interpreting success as inevitability and failure as simple misjudgment. The reality, as Abu Sufyan had learned through decades of experience, was far more nuanced. Victory was rarely absolute, compromise was constant, and every decision carried hidden costs. Memory compresses, but life is expansive and intricate. This reflection also offered perspective on personal legacy. While public memory might reduce a lifetime to simplified narratives, the internal knowledge of one's actions, motivations, and intentions carries its own significance. The awareness of having navigated peril, balanced competing priorities, and endured the pressures of leadership shapes the individual, even as public recognition remains partial. In this sense, legacy exists both in what is recorded and in the lived experience that gave rise to it, the quiet, invisible foundation that supports visible outcomes. Abu Sufyan could see the patterns of remembrance even as he approached the final years of life. The stories that would circulate, the judgments that would be passed, and the lessons drawn by future generations would inevitably miss many of the complexities he had navigated. Yet this understanding did not diminish the value of action. Rather, it emphasized the importance of integrity, prudence, and the careful management of both public and private responsibilities. Leadership, he knew, was not performed for history alone. It was lived, moment by moment, in the choices that affected real people and real communities. Even as the world moved forward, he reflected on the duality of remembrance and forgetfulness. What survives in memory may be selective, but the living impact of decisions, the structures preserved, and the relationships maintained endure far longer than any story can convey. This duality highlights the interplay between visibility and invisibility, public and private, legend and reality, a tension that defined much of his life and would shape the understanding of his era. In contemplating what history would remember and what it would forget, Abu Sufyan found a measure of peace. Recognition was fleeting, but influence persisted. Narrative was partial, but consequence endured. The life he had led, marked by vigilance, responsibility, and reflection, left its imprint not only in memory, but in the ongoing reality of the city, the tribe, and the world he had navigated. As he settled into the quieter days of late life, this understanding offered a gentle closure, allowing reflection to coexist with the knowledge that some truths are felt, even when unseen. Looking back across decades of upheaval, Abu Sufyan could trace patterns, lessons, and truths that extended far beyond the immediate events of his life. Leadership had demanded vigilance, judgment, and endurance. Yet it had also revealed deeper insights about humanity, the fragility of power, and the resilience required to survive in a world of constant change. Reflection distilled experience into understanding, allowing him to see not only what had been accomplished, but also what had been learned through struggle, compromise, and perseverance. One enduring lesson was the complexity of human nature. Alliances, rivalries, and loyalties were never static. People acted according to interest, principle, fear, or ambition. Understanding others required careful observation, patience, and a recognition of both their strengths and weaknesses. Misjudgments could have serious consequences, and yet even errors were instructive. Each decision illuminated patterns of behavior, the subtleties of trust, and the nuanced balance between influence and humility. Leadership demanded not only authority, but empathy, a capacity to anticipate motives, and a willingness to adjust when circumstances shifted. Another insight centered on the burdens of responsibility. Authority is never without cost, and the higher one rises, the more isolation and pressure accompany it. Decisions carry consequences for both the immediate and the distant, and every choice is a negotiation between risk and reward, personal judgment and public duty. The lessons of vigilance, careful calculation, and moral reflection were inseparable from the practical requirements of governance. Surviving decades of turbulence required both fortitude and self-awareness, an understanding that the welfare of others is inseparably linked to one's own decisions and character. The life of turbulence also illuminated the nature of survival. Stability was rarely permanent, yet resilience, adaptability, and foresight could extend influence and protect communities. Anticipating change, preparing for contingencies, and balancing immediate needs against long-term goals were essential practices. Survival was less about strength alone and more about the careful navigation of social, political, and economic realities. It required patience, strategic thinking, and a willingness to endure discomfort in order to secure enduring outcomes. In observing history's selective memory, Abu Sufyan recognized a final lesson. Legacy is complex. Public recollection may simplify, distort, or overlook nuances, but the real impact of leadership exists in structures preserved, relationships nurtured, and lessons internalized. The life lived, the choices made, and the vigilance exercised all contribute to outcomes that persist even when stories are incomplete. True legacy is as much about enduring influence as it is about recognition, and understanding this distinction brings clarity and peace to a life of service. Through these reflections, patterns of continuity and change emerged. Power is temporary, yet the principles that guide its use endure. Conflict is inevitable, yet it teaches resilience. Fear and uncertainty are constant companions, yet careful judgment transforms them from obstacles into instruments of insight. Life in a world of turbulence demands both courage and wisdom, balancing immediate action with long-term perspective and harmonizing personal conscience with communal responsibility. Abu Sufyan's insights were not abstract. They were drawn from lived experience, forged in the crucible of decades marked by unpredictability, rivalry, and challenge. Each lesson, each observation, offered guidance for future generations, not as prescriptive rules, but as distilled wisdom grounded in practical reality. The story of his life, turbulent as it had been, became a compendium of understanding about leadership, survival, and the human condition. As reflection gave way to the recognition of time's passage, the mind naturally turned toward closure. The trials, triumphs, and quiet moments of introspection all converged in a single, unspoken acknowledgement. A life of turbulence is also a life of learning, growth, and endurance. From this awareness, the final chapter naturally follows, offering farewell to the story while allowing the lessons, reflections, and enduring influence of such a life to linger beyond its end. After decades marked by vigilance, decisions, and the constant interplay of power, loyalty, and change, the rhythms of life began to slow. Abu Sufyan's world, once filled with the urgency of trade negotiations, political maneuvering, and tribal rivalries, gradually softened into a quieter, more reflective pace. The city of Mecca continued its bustling life, but for him, the days became gentler, the nights longer, and the burdens of leadership transformed into memories, lessons, and quiet contemplation. In this final period, the noise of responsibility gave way to the gentle cadence of reflection. Each decision, conflict, and triumph of the past seemed to settle into a larger story, one that connected the efforts of a lifetime to the enduring rhythms of the city, the tribe, and the land. The triumphs remained, the mistakes were acknowledged, and the lessons learned became a silent companion, offering both comfort and clarity. The city's pulse continued, carrying the echoes of past turbulence, yet the present held a calm permanence, as if time itself had slowed to allow for quiet observation. There was a beauty in this gradual fade, a recognition that every life, no matter how extraordinary or tumultuous, ultimately returns to a natural stillness. The lessons of survival, leadership, and human complexity lingered not as noise, but as gentle imprints, shaping those who followed and influencing the subtle currents of the world. Abu Sufyan could see the legacy of his choices reflected in the people around him, the cohesion of the tribe, and the subtle balance of alliances maintained over decades. These were the quiet rewards of a life fully lived. Even in moments of solitude, there was warmth. The private reflections of decades gave way to acceptance, a recognition that the energy and vigilance of earlier years had fulfilled their purpose. The struggles of the past, the sleepless nights, and the heavy decisions now existed as part of a larger tapestry, each thread contributing to a story that extended beyond individual experience. The mind, once consumed by constant calculation, found a gentle stillness, and the heart, once burdened with responsibility, felt the soft release of completion. As the final days unfolded, Abu Sufyan's life seemed to merge with the timeless rhythm of the city. The streets, the markets, the caravans, and the conversations of everyday people continued uninterrupted. Carrying forward the world he had navigated with care and foresight, his own presence became quieter, a silent observer of the cycles of life, aware that every moment of influence had already shaped the future in ways both visible and unseen. There was a serene understanding that life's most lasting contributions are not always loudly proclaimed, but quietly sustained through action, example, and careful stewardship. In this gentle fade, the fears of earlier years, the weight of responsibility, the tension of alliances, the unpredictability of human behavior, softened into the calm certainty that the foundations laid, the lessons taught, and the guidance offered would persist beyond the span of a single life. The city, the tribe, and the generations yet to come would carry forward the echoes of experience, subtly woven into their daily rhythms, decisions, and relationships. The final moments were not defined by grand events or dramatic resolution, but by peace. The life that had been filled with turbulence, vigilance, and reflection now moved toward rest, a natural, quiet return to the stillness that awaits all. It was a soft fade into history's long night, a gentle conclusion to decades of challenge, endurance, and thoughtful leadership. And as the city continued under the soft glow of its lamps, the rhythm of life persisted, carrying forward the echoes of a life well lived. The lessons, the guidance, and the quiet strength endured, not as loud monuments, but as gentle currents, shaping the world quietly and faithfully. In this, there was warmth, calm, and the gentle satisfaction that every life, no matter how turbulent, ultimately finds its place in the long night of history, resting peacefully and leaving behind the quiet imprint of its journey.